December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor is burning. Japanese aircraft have just sunk or crippled 8 American battleships, the trophies of the decisive battle doctrine, the prizes that 40 years of Japanese naval strategy taught them to value above all else. And on the hills above the harbor, sitting in the open, almost completely undefended, are the fuel storage tanks of the Pacific Fleet, 4.5 million barrels of oil, the entire fuel reserve of the American war effort in the Pacific. The Japanese pilots fly directly over them. They do not drop a single bomb. Chester Nimitz will say later that if the Japanese had destroyed that oil, they would have set the American advance back far longer than the loss of the battleships ever did, because the fleet could not have operated out of Pearl Harbor at all without it. They came for the ships, they ignored the fuel, and that single blind spot, visible on the very first day of the war, is the blind spot that will kill the Imperial Japanese Navy. Because the Japanese admirals saw warships. They always saw warships. What they never saw, what they never understood, from the first day to the last, was fuel. Where it came from, how it moved, and what it meant that one navy had solved the problem of keeping a fleet alive at sea without ever coming home, while the other navy had not. This is the story of the thing the Japanese never knew. And it starts with 2 Americans whose names you cannot say because history forgot to remember them. But to understand what the Japanese never saw, you first have to understand what they believed. And what they believed begins not on the morning of Pearl Harbor, but 40 years earlier, in a narrow strait between Korea and Japan, with a victory so total that it became a religion. May 27th, 1905. The Strait of Tsushima. The Russian Baltic Fleet has just completed one of the most brutal voyages in naval history. 18,000 miles from the dockyards of St. Petersburg, around the Horn of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and north through the South China Sea. 7 months at sea. The ships have stopped at every coaling station and friendly port along the way, and every stop has cost them time, secrecy, and readiness. Their hulls are fouled with marine growth. Their engines are unreliable. Their crews are exhausted, seasick, demoralized by months of boredom and breakdowns, and the slow grinding knowledge that the Japanese know exactly where they are and exactly when they will arrive. And the Japanese are waiting. Admiral Togo Heihachiro has kept his fleet close to home, concentrated, rested, and drilled to a razor edge, while the Russians stagger toward him across half the world. He has the luxury of choosing his ground. He has the luxury of fighting fresh against an enemy that has been worn down by the single oldest problem in naval warfare, distance. The battle lasts 2 days. It is not close. Togo sinks 21 Russian ships. He loses 3 torpedo boats. The Russian fleet, which left home as one of the most powerful naval forces on Earth, simply ceases to exist, and in the offices and classrooms and wardrooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a lesson crystallizes. It is clean and elegant and dangerously simple. Distance destroys the attacker. A fleet that crosses an ocean arrives weakened, and if you wait, if you concentrate your strength and choose your moment, you can annihilate it in a single decisive blow. That lesson was correct in 1905. It would remain correct for 30 years after, and it would become the foundation on which the Japanese would build an empire, fight a world war, and lose everything, because the lesson had a hidden assumption inside it, buried so deep that no one thought to question it. The assumption was this: the attacker has to stop. He has to come into port. He has to refuel, rearm, repair, and rest. And every time he stops, he is vulnerable, and every time he moves again, he is weaker than before. That assumption was about to become obsolete. But the men who built their careers on Tsushima would never see it. The doctrine had a name. They called it Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. The theory was not original. It was borrowed, and the irony of that borrowing cuts deep. The intellectual father of Kantai Kessen was an American naval historian named Alfred Thayer Mahan, whose book The Influence of Sea Power Upon History was published in 1890 and was required reading at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy and the Naval Staff College. Mahan argued that wars at sea are won by concentrating your battle fleet and destroying the enemies in a single overwhelming engagement. Command the sea, and you command the war. The Japanese read Mahan more carefully than the Americans did. They took his theories and welded them to the memory of Tsushima, and what came out? A strategy that dominated Japanese naval thinking for 4 decades. Kantai Kessen assumed a specific future. It assumed that one day, Japan and the United States would go to war. It assumed that the American fleet would come charging across the Pacific because it would have to the Philippines, Guam, the Western Pacific. All of it would be at stake. And it assumed that the American fleet, like the Russian fleet before it, would arrive weakened by the crossing, stretched, thin, far from its bases, burning through fuel and ammunition, with no way to replace them except by turning around and going home. Japan would not meet that fleet head-on at the start. Japan would let it come. Submarines would pick at it. Land-based bombers from the island garrisons would thin it out. And then, somewhere in the Western Pacific, in waters that Japan had chosen and prepared, the Imperial fleet would rise from its anchorages at Truk, at Linga Roads, at Brunei, fully fueled, fully armed, and it would fall on the battered Americans and finish them in one great afternoon. One battle, one decision. The war over, the doctrine had its guardians, conservative admirals like Osamu Nagano, who served as chief of the Naval General Staff, made certain that Kantai Kessen remained the dominant strategy year after year, even as younger officers argued that submarines and aircraft carriers were making the old battleship duel obsolete. The old guard did not listen. The big guns were the doctrine. The decisive battle was the doctrine. And you did not rise in the Imperial Japanese Navy by questioning the doctrine. But there was one man who questioned it, and he was the most important admiral Japan had. On January 7th, 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, 56 years old, wrote a memorandum that history would remember as a prophecy. He warned that the growing dominance of the airplane and the submarine meant that the single great decisive fleet engagement would never take place. He demanded that the Navy expand its air forces and train its commanders for the many smaller battles that would replace the one great clash that Kantai Kessen promised. Yamamoto could see that the doctrine was wrong. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial power in a way that most of his peers did not, and he had warned the Japanese government plainly that a long war against the United States was a war Japan could not win. But the war was less than a year away. Yamamoto did not to dismantle a belief system that had been building since 1905. He did not have the political weight to overrule Nagano and the old guard. And here is the detail that matters most for the story I am telling you. Even Yamamoto, the man who saw furthest, did not see the thing that would matter most. He saw that Kantai Kessen was wrong about tactics. He did not see that it was wrong about logistics. He understood that the decisive battle would not happen because carriers and submarines had changed the nature of combat. He did not understand that the decisive battle would not happen Because the Americans were about to solve a problem that no navy had ever solved, the problem of keeping a fleet alive indefinitely without coming home. Yamamoto questioned the doctrine, but he questioned the right doctrine for the wrong reason. And the blind spot he carried, the blind spot about fuel, about supply, about the invisible machinery that keeps a fleet fighting, was the same blind spot that every admiral in the Imperial Japanese Navy carried. It was the blind spot born at Tsushima, and it was on full display on the morning of December 7th, 1941. You have already seen the image. The fuel tanks on the hills above Pearl Harbor, 4.5 million barrels untouched. But now that you know where the doctrine came from, now that you understand Tsushima and Mahan and 40 years of Kantai Kessen, you can see why those tanks were invisible. The Japanese strike plan for Pearl Harbor was built by men who had spent their entire careers studying how to destroy an enemy battle fleet. The target list read like a chapter from Mahan's book, Battleships First, then cruisers, then airfields to suppress the fighters. The targets were warships, because warships were what the decisive battle required. The targets were steel and guns and armor, because Kantai Kessen measured power in steel and guns and armor. Fuel was not on the list, because fuel was logistics, and logistics was not strategy. Logistics was the dull, unglamorous work and supply officers. The work that happened in the background while the warrior planned. That would decide everything. It was beneath the notice of the men who carried the swords. And so the pilots flew over the fuel tanks and did not see them. There were operational reasons too. Admiral Nagumo chose not to launch a third strike wave, fearing the American carriers that had not been found in the harbor. But the deeper truth is that the fuel tanks were never on the target list in the first place. The strike plan was built around warships, because the doctrine was built around warships. Fuel was not a decisive target. Ships were decisive targets. Ships won battles. Ships won wars. The same blind spot that made the fuel invisible at Pearl Harbor would make the American logistics system invisible for the next 4 years. The Japanese would keep looking for warships to fight in a decisive battle, and the slow gray ships full of oil that were quietly making the decisive battle impossible would pass beneath their notice again and again and again. But here is where the story turns. Because 300 miles south of Greenland, 24 years before Pearl Harbor, the thing that Japanese would never understand had already been born, and the man who helped deliver it was the same man who would one day command the entire Pacific War. The spring of 1917. The North Atlantic, cold and rough. The United States has just entered the First World War, and a squadron of American destroyers needs to cross the Atlantic to join the fight against Germany. But destroyers are short-legged ships. They are fast, they are hungry, and they do not carry enough fuel to make the crossing on their own. In any previous war, they would have had to stop at a friendly port along the way and fill their tanks at a dock. The Navy sends along its newest fleet oiler instead, a ship called USS Maumee, hull number A02, the second fleet oiler the Navy has ever built, and the first large American warship driven by diesel engines. Her commanding officer is Lieutenant Commander Henry Dinger. Her executive officer and chief engineer is a 32-year-old lieutenant from Fredericksburg, Texas, named Chester Nimitz. Dinger and Nimitz have spent months studying the blueprints of every ship in the fleet, sketching out a procedure that the United States Navy has never attempted in earnest. They want to bring 2 ships alongside each other on the open ocean, both of them moving, and pump fuel across the gap between them while the sea rolls underneath. The accepted method, the cautious method, is to trail the oiler behind the receiving ship and pass the hose over the stern. It is slow, clumsy, and the hose breaks constantly. Dinger and Nimitz have a different idea. They will bring the ships side by side, close aboard, and run the fuel lines across using wooden saddles hung from the cargo booms, while both ships drive into the sea together. On May 28th, 1917, roughly 300 miles south of Greenland, they try it. It works. Momi takes on 6 destroyers, one at a time, and pumps roughly 20,000 gallons into each of them. The 2 ships holding station perilously close together in the North Atlantic swell. By July 5th, she has fueled 34 destroyers and sent them on across the Atlantic to the war. And at the same time, serving on the staff of Vice Admiral Henry Mayo, commander of the Atlantic Fleet, is an officer named Ernest King, known to have been involved in the fleet challenges of the period. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command, King was engaged with the problem of fleet logistics from the Atlantic Fleet headquarters. The 2 men who would hold supreme command of the entire Pacific War, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet and the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, were both grappling with the question of how to keep ships fueled at sea in 1917. The seed had been planted, but knowing how to do something once and building it into a system that can sustain 1,000 ships across the widest ocean on Earth are 2 entirely different things, and in between lay 20 years in which the idea nearly died. The conventional wisdom of the 1920s and 1930s held that you could refuel a ship like a destroyer alongside, but that big ships, battleships, carriers, cruisers were too large and too dangerous to bring close together while moving. Too much mass, too much inertia, too much risk. It was Nimitz again who proved the doubters wrong. In the spring of 1939, now a rear admiral commanding a battleship division, he personally pushed the experiments that showed you could bring a great warship alongside an oiler, close aboard, and run multiple fuel lines across at once, and do it fast, and do it safely, even in a seaway. The broadside method, the alongside method, faster, cleaner, and more efficient than anything the Japanese or the Germans ever fielded. It became the standard practice of the United States Navy, and the capability that was born on the deck of the Maumee in 1917, the capability that Nimitz had helped invent as a young lieutenant and then rescued as an admiral, would become the thing that Chester Nimitz himself would later call the secret weapon of the Second World War. But in 1939, the secret weapon was still just a technique, a procedure, a set of fuel lines and saddles and seamanship drills. It was not yet a system. It was not yet a machine that could keep an entire fleet alive on the open ocean for months at a time, thousands of miles from home, fighting battle after battle, without ever going back. To become that, it would need a war, and it would need 2 men whose names, unlike Nimitz and King, you have almost certainly never heard. Their names were William Calhoun and Worrell Carter, and their story begins in the worst months of 1942, when the assumptions of Kantai Kessen were about to collide with the reality of a fleet that had quietly stopped playing by the old rules. William Lowndes Calhoun was born in Palatka, Florida, on July 13th, 1884. He was a great-grandson of John C. Calhoun, the Vice President of the United States. He graduated from the Naval Academy on February 12th, 1906, near the top of his class, And he went to sea the way all young officers went to sea in those years, with the absolute certainty that the Navy existed to fight battles with big guns on blue water. And then, on the night of September 8th, 1923, the sea taught him something else. Calhoun was commanding the destroyer USS Young, hull number DD-312, steaming in formation with Destroyer Squadron 11 off the California coast. A thick fog had rolled in. The lead destroyer, Delphi, was navigating by dead reckoning, and the reckoning was dead wrong. At 2,105, Delphi ran hard aground off Honda Point at 20 knots, and one by one, in follow-the-leader formation, the ships behind her piled onto the rocks. Young's hull was torn open by a jagged pinnacle of rock, and then she drove into the still revolving propellers of Delphi, which ripped her open further. She capsized in 90 seconds. 90 seconds. 1.5 minutes from a ship on her way to a ship on her side, trapping the engine room and fire room crews below decks in the dark. Calhoun knew there was no time to launch boats, no time to lower rafts. He passed the word for every man to climb to the port side and stay there, and he held that crew together on the hull of an overturned destroyer in a breaking sea until rescue came. 20 of his men died that night. 7 destroyers were lost. It was the worst peacetime disaster in the history of the United States Navy. The Board of Investigation commended Lieutenant Commander Calhoun for his coolness, his intelligence, and his seaman-like ability. They said his conduct was directly responsible for the greatly reduced loss of life. He was cleared of blame, but the memory of that night, the memory of how fast the sea takes a ship when something goes wrong, the sound of steel folding, the voices of men he could not reach, stayed with him for the rest of his career. He carried it all the way to December of 1939, when he was given a job that no ambitious officer wanted: Commander, Base Force, Pacific Fleet. It was a logistics command, a supply command. The fighting admirals did not envy him. There is no glory in fuel oil and canned beans and spare parts. And then Pearl Harbor happened. And on February 27th, 1942, the base force was renamed the Service Force, Pacific Fleet, and Calhoun was promoted to Vice Admiral, and the man who had learned on the rocks of Honda Point exactly how fragile ships are was handed the job of keeping every ship in the Pacific Fleet alive across the widest ocean on Earth. He did not sink a single enemy ship during the entire war. He did something that I would argue mattered more. He made it so that the men who sank ships never had to stop. The second man was Worrell Reed Carter, and his very first breath tells you something about what he was made for. He was born aboard a sailing ship called the Storm King in January of 1885, born at sea before he ever set foot on dry land. His friends called him Nick. He was a submarine officer. He had served on the staff of Admiral Sims in the First World War as an expert in submarine detection, and he was, by every account, a quiet, methodical, unglamorous organizer, the kind of officer that navies need desperately and reward poorly. In late 943, Carter was given the assignment that would define his life and that history would almost entirely forget. He was told to organize and command something called Service Squadron 10. And here I need to draw a line, because the two things get blurred constantly, and they are not the same. The Service Force, Calhoun's command, was the whole vast enterprise run from Pearl Harbor. It planned, gathered, and moved the oceans of fuel, and the mountains of ammunition, and the rivers of food. It was the brain and the spine of the logistics system. Service Squadron 10, Carter's command, was something narrower and more extraordinary. It was a base that was not a base. a floating, mobile, seagoing harbor that physically picked itself up and moved forward across the Pacific as the fighting fleet advanced. From Majuro to Etok to Ulithi to Leyte, always staying just behind the front line, so that the combat ships never had far to go to find everything a home port could give them. Calhoun ran the system. Carter ran the moving piece of it that lived in the war zone. Above them both stood Nimitz. Behind Nimitz in Washington stood King, setting the strategy. Now hold those 4 names, because the Japanese admirals you already know, Yamamoto, Koga, Ozawa, Kurita, Toyoda, are about to run headfirst into the thing those 4 Americans built, and not one of them will fully understand what hit them. The first collision came on 942, and it came as a ghost. In the spring of that year, in the worst months of the war, American aircraft carriers began doing something that the Japanese could observe but could not explain. They appeared in places where they should not have been able to reach. April 18th, 1942. 16 Ask bombers launched from the deck of the carrier Hornet and struck Tokyo. The Doolittle raid. It was a pinprick in military terms, but it was a thunderclap in strategic ones, because the Japanese could not understand how the Americans had gotten there. The launch point was deep in the Western Pacific, far beyond the range that any carrier force could reach if it had to fuel from a port. The answer that the Japanese apparently did not grasp was that the oilers Sifron and Sabine had refueled Halsey's Task Force 16 at sea, in the open ocean, far from any base, topping off every ship so that the strike force could reach a point that no port-fueled fleet could ever have touched. When a Japanese picket boat spotted the task force, and Halsey had to launch the bombers early, still hundreds of miles short of the planned launch point, the margin that allowed the mission to happen at all had been bought by fuel pumped across the open ocean from ship to ship, and the Doolittle raid was not alone. In the months that followed, American carriers struck the Marshalls. They hit Wake Island. They raided Marcus Island. They appeared, struck, and vanished, again and again, in waters where the Japanese expected no threat, because no fleet operating from Pearl Harbor had the range to reach those waters and still have fuel to fight and fuel to get home. Unless it was not operating from Pearl Harbor, unless it was being fed on the way. The Japanese watched these raids. They noted them. They were alarmed by them. But they explained them the way men explain things that do not fit their theory. They called it recklessness, American aggression, desperation, maybe. What they did not call it was logistics, because logistics was not something the Japanese naval mind was trained to see as a strategic variable. Logistics was background noise. Logistics was something that happened before the battle, not something that changed the shape of the battle itself. And so the ghost passed in front of them, and they did not recognize it. By the time Admiral Minachi Koga took command of the combined fleet in April of 1943, succeeding Yamamoto after his death, the ghost had been operating in plain sight for a year. But Koga did not see it either. Koga was 57 years old, a career surface officer, a believer. He inherited Yamamoto's fleet, but not Yamamoto's doubts. Where Yamamoto had questioned Kantai Kessen, Koga embraced it completely. His plan, known as Plan Z, was the purest expression of the decisive battle doctrine that the Imperial Japanese Navy ever produced. The concept was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its assumptions. Koga would not go out to find the American fleet. He would wait. He would hold the combined fleet at its forward bases and let the Americans come to him, because they had to come. If Japan held its island perimeter, the Americans would have to attack it, and when they attacked, their fleet would be at the far end of a supply that stretched thousands of miles back to Pearl Harbor or to the west coast. They would arrive weakened by distance, and Koga would be waiting, fresh and concentrated, for the decisive moment. In a post-war account drawing on the testimony of Japanese commanders, Koga's plan was described not as a strategy to draw the Americans into battle, but simply to wait until the Americans came up in the certain belief that they were bound to come up if Japan only waited. That single sentence contains the entire Japanese theory of the Pacific War. Wait at the base. Let them come to you. They will be weak when they arrive because the ocean will weaken them, the way it weakened the Russians at Tsushima. Koga was certain because certainty was all the doctrine allowed. And while he waited, on the other side of the Pacific, Carter's Service Squadron 10 was assembling at Majuro in the Marshall Islands, and Calhoun's service force was building the conveyor belt that would make Koga's certainty obsolete. Koga never lived to see it. On March 31st, 1944, flying from Palau in a storm, his plane disappeared. He was 58 years old. His body was never found, but his plan survived him briefly and catastrophically. Because the aircraft carrying his chief of staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, crash-landed near Cebu in the Philippines on the same night. Fukudome was captured by Filipino guerrillas, and the documents he was carrying, the complete text of Plan Z, the blueprint for the decisive battle, were recovered and passed to American intelligence. The Americans now held in their hands the exact war plan of the Japanese Navy. They could see, in the Japanese commander's own words, what the enemy expected. They could see the assumption about American logistics that lay beneath every line of the plan, and they knew, with the quiet confidence of men who had spent 2 years building something their enemy could not imagine, that the assumption was wrong. And then, in February of 1944, the Americans proved it. Operation Hailstone. The raid on Truk Atoll was the most powerful Japanese naval base in the Central Pacific. The Americans called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. It was the forward anchor of the entire Japanese defensive perimeter, the place where the combined fleet was supposed to gather, fuel, and wait for the decisive battle. It had anchorages and repair facilities, and fuel storage, and an airfield, and the Japanese had invested enormous resources in fortifying it because they assumed, as Kantai Kessen required them to assume, that the Americans would have to come and take it, that any advancing fleet would need Truk's harbor as its own forward base, because fleets need harbors the way lungs need air. On February 17th and 18th, American carrier aircraft swept over Truk and tore it apart. They destroyed approximately 17,000 tons of fuel. They sank roughly 200,000 tons of shipping, including tankers and transports that Japan could never replace. The airfield was cratered. The anchorage was littered with burning wrecks. But the Americans did not invade. They did not land a single Marine. They wrecked the base from the air, and then they sailed away and left it. And that, for any Japanese strategist paying attention, should have been the most terrifying thing of all. In every previous war in the age of steam, an advancing fleet had to capture enemy harbors because it needed those harbors for its own supply. You could not bypass a fortress like Truk because you needed what Truk contained: the dry docks, the fuel tanks, the warehouses. The whole logic of the island-by-island advance that the Japanese had planned to resist was built on this necessity. The Americans had just announced, without saying a word, that the necessity no longer existed. They did not need Truk. They did not need its harbor. They did not need its fuel tanks. They carried their own harbor with them. Carter's Service, Squadron 10, could turn any undefended atoll with a deep lagoon into a functioning naval base in a matter of weeks, Our sheet and the fleet train, the oilers and ammunition, ships and stores ships, could keep the fighting fleet supplied at sea without ever touching a dock. The great ring of island fortresses that the Japanese had garrisoned at such enormous cost, Truk, Rabaul, Kwajalein, Wachi, Jaluit, had been built on the assumption that the Americans would have to take them one by one. The Americans simply went around them. They neutralized them from the air, left their garrisons to starve, and leaped forward to seize some lightly held atoll that nobody had ever heard of, because any atoll with a lagoon could become a naval base when the base itself floated. The Japanese had built walls. The Americans had learned to fly over them, and the engine that gave them wings was not an airplane, it was an oiler. But I need to stop here and say something that this audience deserves to hear, because it cuts against the lazy version of this story, and I will not feed you a lazy version. The Japanese were not stupid about refueling at sea. They were not ignorant of the idea. In fact, before the war, Japan had been ahead of the United States in fast tanker construction. The Imperial Japanese Navy practiced its own form of underway refueling. Japanese naval architects understood the engineering. Japanese officers understood the concept. The failure was not a failure of imagination. It was something worse. It was a failure of industry and a failure of doctrine. Working together, reinforcing each other, creating a blind spot so total that even intelligent, experienced men could not see past it. The industrial failure first. Japan entered the war with a merchant fleet of roughly 6.5 million tons. That sounds like a large number until you understand what it had to do. That tonnage had to carry every barrel of oil, every ton of iron ore, every bushel of rice, every sheet of rubber that the Japanese war machine consumed. It had to supply the home islands, feed the civilian population, and move troops and equipment across an empire that stretched from Burma to the Central Pacific. It was barely enough in peacetime. In wartime, it was a starvation diet. And then the American submarines came. In 1943, American submarines sank 1,340,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. The volume of imports into Japan fell from 35 million tons in 1942 to 27 million in 1943. And that was before the submarines found their real target. In late 1943, the United States Navy made a decision that would quietly seal Japan's fate. It made tankers the top priority target for its submarine force. Not warships, not troop transports, tankers, because the men running the American submarine war understood, with a clarity that their Japanese counterparts never matched, that Japan was an industrial nation that ran on imported oil. Cut the oil and everything else dies. The factories stop. The ships stop. The planes stop. The war stops. The submarines went hunting, and they were devastating. By the end of 1944, American submarines and carrier aircraft had destroyed the vast majority of Japan's tanker fleet. By some estimates, roughly 2/3 of the total tonnage, and the losses were still mounting. The oil that Japan had gone to war to secure, the oil from Borneo, from Sumatra, from the Dutch East Indies, was and or sitting in storage tanks at the wellhead because there were no longer enough ships to carry it home. By April of 1945, oil imports into Japan had fallen to zero, not reduced, not diminished, zero. And here is where the failure locks in, because the Japanese Navy had the power to fight the submarine campaign and chose not to. The Japanese submarine force was one of the most capable in the world. Japanese submarines were large, fast, long-ranged, and crewed by brave and well-trained men. But the Imperial Japanese Navy did not use them to protect the tanker fleet. It did not use them to escort convoys. It sent them out to hunt American warships, the glamorous targets, the targets that fit the Kantai Kessen vision of the decisive battle. The submarines were looking for carriers and battleships to sink, because sinking carriers and battleships was how you won the great engagement that would decide everything. And the work of convoy escort, the slow, grinding, unglamorous work of shepherding tankers and freighters across dangerous waters, was treated by the Japanese naval establishment with something close to contempt. It was defensive. It was unheroic. It was beneath the notice of officers who had been raised on Tsushima and trained to seek the decisive blow. The American Navy made the opposite choice. It put its submarines on the enemy's tankers and its oilers on its own fleet, and it protected both. The Japanese put their submarines on warships, left their tankers undefended, and watched their fleet run dry at anchor. Let me put those two choices side by side so the contrast is as stark as it deserves to be. The Americans understood that the war was, at its foundation, a war about fuel. They understood that the nation that could move oil across the ocean and keep its fleet supplied would win, and the nation that could not would lose. Everything the Americans built: the oilers, the fleet train, the mobile base, the convoy escorts, the submarine campaign against Japanese shipping was built on that understanding. The Japanese needed to understand it more than anyone. They were an island nation with almost no domestic oil. They had gone to war specifically to seize oil fields. Their entire strategic position depended on the ability to move oil from where it was produced to where it was needed. And yet they never protected that lifeline. They never built the escorts. They never developed the convoy doctrine. They never assigned the submarines. The decisive battle consumed their attention so completely that they could not see the war of supply that was strangling them month by month. That is not stupidity, that is doctrine. And doctrine, when it is wrong, kills more certainly than any weapon, because the men who follow it cannot imagine that it might be leading them off a cliff. Now let me take you to the moment doctrine met reality at full speed, because the battle that followed is the clearest proof. I know that the war was decided by logistics. Before the first shot was fired, June 1944, the Mariana Islands, Operation Forager. Admiral Soemu Toyoda has taken command of the combined fleet after Koga's death. He is 59 years old, and he has inherited a navy that is weaker than the one Koga inherited from Yamamoto, which was weaker than the one Yamamoto built. The slide is accelerating. But Toyoda still believes, because the doctrine requires him to believe, that one great battle can reverse everything. When the Americans begin landing on Saipan on June 15th, Toyoda activates Operation Ego. This is it. This is Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle that the Japanese Navy has been waiting for since 1905. The mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa will sortie from the Philippines and fall on the American fleet while it is tied down supporting the invasion. Ozawa is 57. He is a carrier admiral, one of the best the Japanese Navy has, and he has a plan that makes sense on paper. His aircraft have longer range than the Americans' Japanese planes, are lighter because they carry no armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks, and that lightness buys distance. Ozawa can launch strikes from outside the range of American retaliation. He can hit them before they can hit him, and he has one more advantage, or so he believes. The Americans have been operating at sea for weeks, supporting the Saipan landings, and by every calculation Ozawa knows they should be running low on fuel, low on ammunition, low on replacement aircraft. By every rule that has governed naval warfare since the age of steam, The American fleet should be near the end of its tether. What Ozawa does not know, what no Japanese admiral fully grasps, is what is waiting behind the American battle line. The United States Navy has organized more than 20 oilers into 8 separate refueling units, each unit consisting of 3 oilers escorted by destroyers. Each unit has been assigned a refueling box on the open ocean, a rectangle of sea 75 miles long and 25 miles wide, and the boxes have been named after oil companies. The estimated fuel consumption is on the order of 100,000 barrels per day, and alongside the oilers, something even more remarkable. Escort carriers, the small, slow, flat tops that the Japanese dismiss as second-rate, have been loaded with dozens of replacement aircraft each and stationed with the refueling groups. When a fast carrier comes alongside an oiler to refuel, replacement planes are catapulted off the escort carrier and flown directly across to the big one, and fresh pilots come over with them. One escort carrier on this operation is carrying more than 60 replacement aircraft for exactly this purpose. The American carriers are not just being refueled at sea. They are being re-equipped with the very thing that makes a carrier its airplanes without ever turning back. Ozawa does not know this. He cannot conceive of it. His own navy is struggling to replace the carrier air crews it has lost, because Japan no longer has the fuel to train new pilots, and it no longer has the aircraft to give them. The pipeline from factory to flight deck to combat that the Americans have built at sea is something that exists entirely outside the boundaries of what Ozawa's experience tells him is possible. And so, on the morning of June 19th, 1944, Ozawa launches everything. 4 attack waves, 373 aircraft, every plane he has, sent against a fleet that he is certain must be weakened and thinning. The American fleet is not weakened. It is not thinning. It is fully fueled, fully armed, and its fighter direction officers, guided by radar that the Japanese barely understand, are stacking Hellcats in the sky like a wall of blue steel. The Japanese pilots fly into it and die. The American sailors will call this day the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the end of it, Ozawa will have lost more than 600 aircraft. His carrier air power, the thing that Japan had spent years building and could never rebuild, is functionally destroyed in a single afternoon. And then the fuel kills his flagship. The carrier Taiho, the newest and most heavily armored carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy, has taken a torpedo from the American submarine Albacore earlier that morning. The damage is manageable. In a properly fueled navy, with refined bunker oil in the tanks, the ship would likely survive. But Taiho is not burning refined oil. She is burning unrefined Borneo crude light, volatile, dangerous, because the Japanese tanker fleet has been so savaged by American submarines that refined fuel is no longer reliably available. The crude is cheap and plentiful at the wellhead, and it burns well enough in a boiler. But when the torpedo ruptures Taiho's hull and the damage control teams try to ventilate the fumes, the volatile vapors from the unrefined oil spread through the ship's ventilation system and fill her compartments with an invisible, explosive atmosphere. At 1430, a senior staff officer on the bridge sees the flight deck heave upward. Taiho's sides blow open. The bottom of her hull splits. She begins to settle. Ozawa transfers his flag to a destroyer. By 1630, the newest carrier in the Japanese Navy is gone, sent to the bottom not by American bombs, but by the fumes of the desperate fuel that Japan's shattered logistics have forced her to burn. Carrier killed by its own fuel crisis. If there is a more perfect symbol of what Kantai Kessen's blind spot cost the Imperial Japanese Navy, I have not found it. And the thing that should have made it all clear, the thing that connected the fuel on Taiho to the fuel in the American oilers, to the entire shape of the war, remained invisible to the Japanese command. They had just lost the decisive battle they had spent 40 years preparing for. And they had lost it not because their ships were weaker or their sailors less brave, but because one fleet had solved the problem of sustaining itself at sea and the other had not. The war had been decided by logistics, and the losing side still did not see it. After the Philippine Sea, the American fleet did not go home. It kept operating. It took Saipan, it took Guam, it took Tinian, and while the fighting fleet pushed forward, Carter's Service Squadron 10 moved forward behind it, leapfrogging from Eniwetok to a place that would become the most remarkable naval installation of the Second World War. On September 23, 1944, American forces took Ulithi Atoll without a fight. The Japanese had left it almost undefended. It was a ring of tiny coral islands in the western Caroline Islands. And what made it priceless was the lagoon in the middle, roughly 20 miles long and 10 miles wide, deep enough to anchor the heaviest ships in the world, large enough to hold a navy. Chester Nimitz looked at it on the chart and called it the Navy's secret weapon. The censors kept the name out of every American newspaper for the rest of the war. The atoll sat barely 90 miles from the bypassed Japanese base at Yap. The Japanese knew it was there. They knew the Americans were using it. But knowing it was there and understanding what it meant were two different things, and the distance between those two was the distance that decided the war. What Carter and the Seabees built at Ulithi was a complete naval base that floated. What? Because nobody expected to hold the atoll forever, they did not build permanent oil tanks on the islands. Instead, they towed in a half-dozen worn-out tankers, anchored them in the lagoon, filled them with fuel, and used the ships themselves as a floating tank farm. They brought in the repair ship Ajax, which had an air-conditioned machine shop that could fabricate almost any part a damaged warship might need. They brought in distilling ships that made fresh water, supply ships that baked bread, a barge that produced 500 gallons of ice cream per shift, because the Navy had learned that you keep men fighting by keeping them. They built something that no Navy had ever built before, floating dry docks large enough to lift a battleship out of the water. The advanced base sectional docks were towed across the Pacific in pieces and welded together on the spot. The largest of them, assembled from 10 sections, ran more than 900 feet long and could lift roughly 90,000 tons, enough to raise a fleet carrier or a battleship completely out of the water for hull and propeller repairs. In one case, the dock crews pumped 700,000 gallons of fuel out of a battleship just to make her light enough to lift. A ship that took battle damage in the Western Pacific no longer had to limp 4,000 miles back to Pearl Harbor. She could be hauled out of the ocean and rebuilt within a few hundred miles of the enemy. The Navy built 58 of these dock sections during the war. For roughly 7 months in the winter of 1944 and the spring of 1945, this lagoon in the middle of nowhere was the largest and busiest anchorage on the face of the earth. By March 13th, 1945, there were 647 ships at anchor there. As the forces gathering for the invasion of Okinawa poured in, the number peaked at 722. 722 ships in a lagoon that had not appeared on any pre-war chart of American naval bases because it had been Japanese territory until the previous autumn. There is a photograph taken on December 8th, 1944, that the sailors called Murderers' Row, and it shows the fast carriers Wasp, Yorktown, Hornet, Hancock, and Ticonderoga lying at anchor in that lagoon in a line, resting, being fed, being repaired, being reloaded in a harbor that the American public had never heard of, and the Japanese could not stop, and now set that image beside the image of the Japanese fleet in the autumn of 1944. Because the contrast is the story. By October, the Japanese Navy could no longer gather its ships in one place, because there was not enough fuel in any one place to move them. Japan had entered the war with a stockpile of around 6 million tons of oil, which the planners had thought might last about a year. The war burned through it at roughly double the expected rate. The fuel storage at Truk had held only about 77,000 tons, enough to fill the tanks of the battleship Yamato perhaps a dozen times and no more. And now Truk was a smoking ruin. The submarine blockade had done its work. The tanker fleet was gone. The oil from Borneo was stranded, and the consequences were written into the very geometry of the largest naval battle in history. Leyte Gulf, October 1944. When Admiral Toyoda activated the Sho Ichigo Plan, the last desperate attempt at a decisive battle, the Japanese forces could not concentrate because fuel would not allow it. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the most powerful surface-striking force Japan had left, built around the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, had to be staged forward to Linga Roads near Singapore and then moved to Brunei Bay on the coast of Borneo for one reason and one reason only. That was where the oil was. They could not fuel the fleet in home waters because the home islands were running dry. And the fuel they burned was the same volatile Borneo crude that had killed Taiho 4 months earlier, pumped almost straight from the ground into the boilers, turning every vessel that carried it into a floating bomb waiting for a spark. Meanwhile, Ozawa's carrier force, the same Ozawa who had lost the Philippine Sea 4 months earlier, sailed south from Japan's inland sea with carriers that were nearly empty of aircraft. Japan no longer had the fuel to train replacement pilots. It no longer had the planes to give them. Ozawa's carriers were not being sent to fight. They were being sent to die. Their mission was to act as bait, to show themselves to Halsey and lure the American fast carriers north, away from the landing beaches, so that Kurita's surface ships could break through San Bernardino Strait and destroy the transports in Leyte Gulf. The entire convoluted, doomed Japanese plan, the forces divided, converging from 3 different directions, the carriers sacrificed as decoys, the battleships threading narrow straits in the dark, was not a plan driven by tactical genius. It was a plan driven by the location of fuel. Every arrow on the Japanese operations map was drawn by the hand of a logistics crisis that the admirals had never been trained to see as the decisive factor it was. And Kurita knew it. In post-war interviews with the American Admiral Thomas Mora, Kurita was asked again and again why the Japanese forces had been destroyed, and again, he came back to the same answer. Fuel was the fundamental factor, he said. He had brought his ships into battle, not knowing whether there was enough fuel to bring them out. His tankers had been sunk or scattered. The only fuel available was whatever remained in his ship's own tanks. And because there was not enough fuel to sail around the landmasses that lay between his anchorage and his target, he was forced to take his fleet through the narrow San Bernardino Strait at night, a passage that was dangerous, predictable, and robbed him of any chance of surprise. His ships sailed slowly. They crept toward Leyte at 16 knots when they should have been making 25, because every knot of speed burned fuel that could not be replaced, and Kurita was trying to save enough to get his surviving ships home after the battle. That slowness, that agonizing, fuel-driven crawl gave the American submarines time to find him. Data and Dace intercepted his force off Palawan and sank the heavy cruisers Ak and crippled Takao before the battle had even begun. And when Kurita finally emerged from San Bernardino Strait on the morning of October 25th of Taffy and found himself facing the escort carriers of Taffy, 3 off the coast of Samar, the most matched surface engagement of the entire war, he was a man fighting with one hand tied behind his back by a fuel gauge he could not refill. Now hold Kurita in your mind. A Vice Admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy, commanding the most powerful surface fleet Japan has left, sailing slowly because he cannot afford the fuel to sail fast, burning unrefined crude that might explode if he is hit, threading a narrow strait because he cannot afford the fuel to go the long way around, not knowing if he has enough fuel to get home. And now look at what is happening on the other side of the ocean at the same time. Between September 1944 and January 1945, the American at-sea logistics group delivered to the fast carriers on the open ocean more than 8 million barrels of fuel oil and more than 14.5 million gallons of aviation gasoline. They did it with 34 oilers working in rotation. Between October 6th, 1944 and January 26th, 1945, the fast carrier force was at sea for 13 of those 16 weeks. 13 of 16 weeks underway in enemy waters, fighting. No fleet in the history of the world had ever done anything remotely like it. The Japanese kept waiting for the Americans to pull back and refit. The Americans simply refused. And when the fighting damaged American ships, the logistics system did not send the whole fleet home with the cripples. It dragged the cripples out instead. In October of 1944, during the carrier strikes against Formosa, Japanese aircraft put torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Canberra and then into the light cruiser Houston. Both ships were dead in the water, flooding, helpless, deep inside the range of Japanese air bases on Formosa. In any previous war, the answer would have been to scuttle them or to strip a major force away to escort them home. The service force did something else entirely. Fleet tugs and salvage ships took both cruisers under tow. A small screen of cruisers and escort carriers covered them. And this battered, crawling column, which the sailors grimly christened Crippled Division 1, was towed more than 1,000 miles across open ocean back to Ulithi. The Japanese, believing they had wounded prey limping away, attacked again and again. Houston took a second torpedo on the way, and she survived. Both ships survived. Both were towed to safety. Both were eventually rebuilt. That is what it means to own the logistics of an ocean. You do not even have to lose the ships the enemy believes he has killed. You drag them away. You fix them on a floating dry dock in a lagoon the enemy cannot reach, and you send them back into the fight. While the enemy who hit them cannot repair his own ships because his dockyards are starving for steel and his shipyard workers are starving for rice because the merchant fleet that was supposed to feed them is sitting on the bottom of the Pacific. 2 navies, 2 systems, one that had mastered the unglamorous work of moving fuel and steel and beans across an ocean, and one that had built its entire identity around the glamorous work of fighting the decisive battle and had treated the unglamorous work with contempt. By October of 1944, the result was no longer in doubt. It had not truly been in doubt since the day the submarines began killing the tankers. The decisive battle that the Japanese had waited for since Tsushima had finally come, and it had been decided before the first shot was fired decided by fuel oil and oiler schedules, and the protection of supply lines, decided by the dull, invisible, unheroic machinery of logistics that one navy had built and the other had despised. Kurita survived Leyte Gulf. He brought his remaining ships home, 4 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 7 destroyers, nursing the last drops of fuel in their tanks. He had lost Musashi, the sister of Yamato, sunk under a storm of American bombs in the Philippine Sea. He had lost cruisers, destroyers, and any remaining illusion that the Imperial Japanese Navy could challenge the Americans at sea. And a few months later, when the Americans invaded Iwo Jima in February of 1945, the Japanese Navy did not contest the landing at sea. It did not send a fleet. It did not send a squadron. The waters around Iwo Jima were conceded to the Americans without a fight. The reason was simple. The Imperial Japanese Navy had elected to conserve fuel for the final defense of the homeland. There was not enough oil left to send ships to sea and bring them back. The fleet that had once ruled the Western Pacific was chained to its anchorages, waiting for a decisive battle that could no longer be fought, burning the last of its reserves to keep the boilers warm on ships that would never sail again. And 722 American ships swung at anchor in a lagoon called Ulithi, 90 miles from a bypassed Japanese garrison that could do nothing but watch. February of 1945. Task Force 58 sorted from Ulithi, refueled at sea from the replenishment groups commanded by Rear Admiral Donald Berry, and on February 16th struck Tokyo, the first American carrier aircraft over the Japanese capital since the Doolittle raid 3 years before. And this time, it was not 16 Army bombers launched from a single carrier on a one-way mission. It was the massed air groups of the fast carrier fleet, hundreds of aircraft, striking the homeland of the enemy from a fleet that had been at sea for days and would remain at sea for weeks, sustained entirely by the oilers and ammunition ships and stores. Ships followed it like a bloodstream follows a body. Then the fleet moved south to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa, and off Okinawa the fleet stayed under constant air attack for weeks that stretched into months, while the kamikazes came day after day, and the logistics force that kept the fleet alive swelled past 95 ships of its own. Think about what that number means. 95 ships whose only job was to feed the fleet that was doing the fighting. A logistics force larger than the entire surface navy of most countries on Earth, devoted not to combat, but to the work of making combat sustainable. Every barrel of oil, every crate of bombs, every sack of flour, every pint of blood plasma carried across the open ocean and transferred from ship to ship while both ships were moving, day after day, week after week, in waters where Japanese aircraft were actively trying to kill them. And then came the last act, the demonstration so complete, so overwhelming in scale, that it stands as the final proof of everything this story has been building toward. On July 21st and 22nd, 1945, the Third Fleet carried out what the Naval History and Heritage Command describes as probably the largest single replenishment at sea operation in history. More than 100 ships of the Third Fleet took on, in 2 days at sea, off the coast of Japan, 6,369 tons of ammunition, 379,157 barrels of fuel oil, 1,635 tons of stores and provisions, 99 replacement aircraft, 412 replacement men, all of it transferred from the oilers and ammunition ships and stores, ships and escort carriers of a single supply group on the open ocean, within range of an enemy that still, even now, in the last summer of the war, believed at some level that a fleet had to come home to do any of this. Raymond Spruance, who understood logistics better than almost any fighting admiral of the war, wrote the introduction to Carter's book after it was all over, and he put it more cleanly than I can. He wrote that for the first time in history, a fleet had steamed to the threshold of an enemy homeland and, with its own air force embarked, stayed there at sea for a period of months until American land and air forces were firmly established on the enemy's doorstep. And then Spruance wrote one more line, a line I think every officer in any service in any country should have to memorize. A sound logistic plan is the foundation upon which a war operation should be based. That is what happened. And even the Royal Navy, the most powerful and experienced navy in the world outside the United States, could not match it. The British Pacific Fleet built its own fleet train and refueled its own carriers at sea. But their tankers were too few and too slow. Their hoses burst. They leaned on borrowed American oilers. And in the middle of August 1945, the British supply line collapsed, and the British task force had to withdraw, while the American carriers stayed on station and kept striking Japan. If the most capable Allied navy on Earth could barely manage it, there is no mystery in the fact that the Japanese admirals could not conceive of it. But the logistics system was not invulnerable, and the men who served aboard the supply ships were not immune to the war they made possible. And I need to stop here and tell you about a ship called Mississauga, because this is a logistics story, and it would be a sin to let logistics become bloodless. November 20th, 1944, Ulithi Lagoon. Early morning. The oiler USS Mississauga, hull number A59, is riding at anchor. She is full of fuel, fully loaded. Tens of thousands of barrels of oil and aviation gasoline sitting in her tanks, waiting to be pumped into the warships that will sortie from this lagoon to fight. A Japanese submarine has crept close to the atoll in the dark. It is carrying a weapon the Americans have not yet encountered in these waters. Chiton, manned suicide torpedoes, a human being sealed inside a modified torpedo, steering it by hand into the side of a ship. One of them finds Mississauga. The explosion is enormous. The ship erupts. Fuel and gasoline and fire and black smoke, and the screaming of men in the water. More than 60 of her crew are killed, burned, drowned, torn apart by a blast that turns a fuel ship into a furnace in seconds. More than 60 names. One ship, one morning. And I want you to sit with this for a moment, because these were not battleship sailors. They were not the men in the gun turrets or the cockpits. They were the crew of an oiler. They had one of the least celebrated jobs in the entire Navy, hauling fuel across the ocean so that other men could fight. There were no songs written about them. There are no movies about them. Their ship's name is not famous. Their battle was not famous. They were the men who carried the oil, and on a morning in a lagoon that most Americans could not find on a map, the war reached out and killed them just as dead as any sailor on any carrier. That is the weight of the sea, and it falls just as heavily on the men who carry the fuel as on the men who fire the guns. And in March of 1945, the Japanese came again. Kamikazes flew all the way out to Ulithi, a round trip that few of them expected to survive, and damaged the carrier Randolph at anchor. So when you hear that Ulithi was a secret, understand precisely what that means. It was secret from the American public, reading their newspapers at the breakfast table. It was not secret from the Japanese. The Japanese knew it was there. They attacked it. They killed Americans there. They simply could not stop what was happening inside that lagoon. because the scale of it was beyond anything they had the resources to destroy. And there is one last piece of this story that I cannot get out of my head, and it is the piece that ties all the threads together. Carter, in his own book, describes the movement of the mobile base forward to Ulithi. He describes the enormous lumbering convoy of unarmed and lightly armed auxiliaries, repair ships, tenders, floating dry docks, barges, stores, ships, tugs creeping across the open ocean at roughly 5 knots. 5 knots, walking speed. A column of slow gray ships stretching across miles of ocean, carrying everything the American fleet needed to live and fight. Completely exposed, the softest target imaginable, the beating heart of the American war effort, naked on the sea. And Carter writes that the Japanese never attacked it. He says he was at a loss to explain why. I think the answer is the same answer this entire story has been about. The Japanese did not attack the fleet train because, at the level of strategy, they did not fully grasp that the fleet train was the target mattered. They were still looking for warships. They were still hunting for the decisive battle. They were still searching for carriers and battleships to sink, because 4 decades of Kantai Kessen had taught them that warships were what decided wars, and the slow gray ships full of oil and beans and spare parts that were quietly making the decisive battle impossible passed beneath their notice. They could see the fleet train. They could not see what it meant, the same way they could see the fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor and could not see what they meant. The same way Ozawa could see that the American fleet should have been exhausted at the Philippine Sea and could not see why it was not. The same way Kurita could feel his own fuel gauges dropping towards zero and could not see why the Americans never seemed to face the same problem. The blind spot was there on December 7th, 1941. It was there on June 19th, 1944. It was there on October 25th, 1944. And it was there in the last months of the war, when a convoy of unarmed ships carrying the entire logistical foundation of the American advance sailed across the Pacific at 5 knots, in plain sight, and the enemy let it pass. Let me give Carter's command its due in numbers, because numbers do not forget. By mid-February of 1945, Service Squadron 10 had grown to roughly 280 floating units, 26 repair ships and tenders, 34 floating ammunition ships, 48 supply and fleet freight units, 100 floating fuel and water storage vessels, 24 seagoing and salvage tugs, 42 small surface craft and harbor tugs, 6 barrack ships. 1 year earlier, that same squadron had consisted of about 50 units, from 50 to 280 in a single year. And Carter himself made a comparison that sounds impossible, but is his, documented in his own book, by 1945. This one American supply squadron contained more seagoing vessels than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy possessed at that point in the war. One supply organization, bigger than the enemy's fleet, and the man who built it and commanded it held the rank of Commodore 1 star. For most of the time, he ran the most important floating base in the history of warfare. He was promoted to Rear Admiral only upon his retirement. He wrote the official history of his own command, because nobody else would write it. And then he slipped almost entirely out of public memory. He died on July 21st, 1975, at the age of 90, in Portsmouth, Virginia. The man who was born on a sailing ship and spent his life making sure that other ships could stay at sea. And Calhoun, William Lowndes Calhoun, the man who had survived Honda Point and had carried the memory of a destroyer capsizing in 90 seconds for the rest of his life, The man James Mitchell said had smothered the Japanese with material. He retired and was eventually promoted to Admiral 4 stars on the retired list. The KIF mission was delivered by Chester Nimitz himself in person on January 14th, 1954 in Coronado, California. Nimitz handing Calhoun the rank he had earned. 9 years after the war was over, Calhoun died on October 20th, 1963, at 79. No popular biography has ever been written about him. Now let me return to where this story began. The interrogation rooms. The autumn of 1945. The quiet accounting of defeat. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, the man who had served as Chief of Staff to Koga, the man who had been carrying Plan Z when his plane crashed in the Philippines, the man who had commanded land-based air forces at Formosa and the Philippines, sits across from American officers of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, and he tells them, in words that were recorded and preserved, that the American advance came faster and reached farther than the Japanese had ever believed possible, that the landing at Leyte Gulf was wholly unexpected, because the Japanese had assumed any landing would come at Manila Bay or further south, that they had been taken by surprise again and again by an enemy that appeared where he should not have been able to appear, in strength that he should not have been able to sustain, at a tempo that no fleet should have been able to maintain. Fukudome is not describing a navy that understood what the Americans had built. He is describing the experience of being surprised, repeatedly and fatally, by an enemy that refused to behave the way navies were supposed to behave. Admiral Toyoda, summing up the war, said that naval force is in the end a consumable, and that Japan had simply overextended its line. Even in defeat, even in the clarity of hindsight, the language is passive, overextended, as if the line had stretched itself, as if the collapse had been an act of nature, rather than the result of a specific, systematic, deliberate American campaign to control the movement of fuel across the Pacific, while Japan was left to starve. And Kurita, the man who had sailed Yamato through San Bernardino Strait in the dark because he could not afford the fuel to go the long way. The man who watched Sashi sinking under American bombs in the Sibuyan Sea. The man who had turned away from the escort carriers off Samar for reasons that historians still debate, but that Kurita himself, in the years after the war, traced back to the same root cause. Fuel was the fundamental factor, he said. The basic one. I want to be careful here, because this channel does not do clean myths, and the truth is more interesting than the myth. I cannot show you a captured document in which a Japanese admiral writes plainly, "We never realized the Americans could rearm at sea." That specific confession, stated that clearly, does not exist in the record as far as I have been able to find. What does exist is something almost as damning. The war plans, built entirely around fixed bases and a single decisive battle. The interrogations, in which man after man describes being surprised by the speed and range and endurance of the American fleet. The strategic decisions, the divided forces at Leyte, the carriers used as bait, the fleet chained to the location of oil that makes sense only if you assume the enemy fleet operates the way every fleet has always operated. When I say the Japanese admirals never knew, I mean precisely this. They built their entire concept of the war on an assumption about how navies must behave, and the United States Navy quietly made that assumption obsolete. And the Japanese were strategically blind to it until it was far too late to matter. The thing that made the American advantage decisive was not any single ship or any single invention. It was the broadside refueling method combined with the moving base, working together as a system. Because the Americans had perfected fueling alongside at high speed, An oiler could top off a carrier in a fraction of the time the old astern method took, and a task force could be back at flank speed and back in the fight within hours. And because the moving base at Leyte or any Wettock was always pushing forward to stay just behind the front, the oilers themselves never had far to go to refill. The fuel came forward in stages, from the United States to the advanced anchorage in the big slow tankers, from the advanced anchorage to the fighting fleet in the fast oilers, from the fast oilers to the carriers alongside at speed. It was a relay, a conveyor belt stretching 5,000 miles across the Pacific, and at the far end of it, a carrier could launch a strike against Tokyo, recover its planes, refuel at sea the next morning, and launch again, week after week after week, while the enemy waited at anchor for a decisive battle that the conveyor belt had already decided. There is a reason you have never heard the names Calhoun and Carter, and the reason tells you something uncomfortable about how institutions remember. Logistics is invisible by design. When it works, nothing happens. The fleet simply stays at sea. The absence of a crisis is the achievement, and you cannot put the absence of a crisis on a magazine cover. There is no decisive moment. There is no 5 minutes that changed everything. There is no photograph of Vice Admiral Calhoun standing on a bridge as the bombs fall, because Calhoun's victory was that the bombs the Americans dropped never ran out, and the fuel never ran dry. A fighting admiral's success is a burning enemy carrier. You can see it. You can photograph it. You can put it on the cover of Life magazine and build a documentary around it. A logistics admiral's success is a thing that did not happen. A retreat to port that was never necessary, a campaign that never had to pause, an ammunition shortage that never occurred, and human beings, and the institutions that human beings build, are very bad at remembering the disaster that was prevented. We remember the battle that was won. We forget the supply line that made winning possible. Calhoun was not mistreated. Carter was not scapegoated. The Navy did not fail them the way it failed some of the combat admirals this story could have covered. Nobody relieved them in disgrace, but the system did something quieter, and in its way just as telling. It simply forgot to celebrate them, because their triumph took the form of an absence, the absence of a fleet that never had to retreat, and an institution that runs on visible heroism does not know how to honor an invisible one. So here are the numbers, one more time, because I want them to be the thing that stays with you after the screen goes dark. More than 8 million barrels of fuel oil, and more than 14.5 million gallons of aviation gasoline, delivered to the carriers at sea in a single 4-month stretch. 13 of 16 weeks underway in enemy waters without going home. 722 ships at anchor in a lagoon that did not exist on the pre-war charts. 6,369 tons of ammunition and 399,157 barrels of fuel transferred to more than 100 ships in 2 days on the open ocean off the coast of Japan. A floating base that grew from 50 ships to 280 in 1 year. On one supply squadron on larger than the entire enemy fleet. The Japanese admirals built a strategy around an assumption about how navies must behave. 2 American officers spent their careers making sure the United States Navy did not have to behave that way. The Japanese never fully understood what had been done to them. And many Americans, 80 years later, still do not understand who did it. They were waiting for a fleet that had to come home. It never came home. And the men who made sure it never had, to the men who carried the oil and built the floating harbors and baked the bread and fabricated the spare parts and pumped the fuel across a 60-foot gap between 2 ships moving through a heaving sea, are the men whose names belong in the front of the story, not the footnotes. If your father or your grandfather served aboard one of the oilers, or the ammunition ships, or the repair ships of the service force, aboard the Mississauga, or the Ajax, or any of the grey unglamorous ships of the fleet train, I would like to hear about it. Those men did the work that kept everyone else alive, and they have waited a long time for the credit. Those stories matter, and on this channel, they get told.